Good morning. Welcome to Grover Hill Zion United Methodist Church here at 204 South Harrison Street here in Grover Hill. We're glad you're viewing here on this 11th Sunday after Pentecost. We hope this message will be helpful to you. It's about not giving up. It's about persevering, if you will. It's about believing in God's promises. Well, you're also welcome to come and be with us on Sunday mornings at 10:30 and worship together with us. This story this morning, and this message this morning, comes from Numbers chapter 13 through chapter 14, verse 12. It's a story about the Israelites and God telling them to go and take the land. The land of Israel belongs to the Jews by divine right. They were promised even more land than they currently occupy. It was promised to them by God through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to belong to them for all time. They did wrong in the eyes of God, and God allowed them to be conquered a number of times. They lost the land because they rejected God, but He eventually restored the land back to them. The last time, I believe it was 1948, it was restored to them. And they have their enemies living all around them, but for a tiny nation, they're very powerful. Never giving up and trying something else when all seems to be lost. That's hard for us to do, isn't it? Many years ago, I was a scoutmaster, and all through the 80s, and every year I take a group of Boy Scouts to Camp Lakota over here at Defiance for a week, where it gives them an opportunity to have fun, to learn some camping skills, cooking skills, swimming and canoeing, marksmanship skills and archery, those kinds of things, as well as earn merit badges. The little merit badges is how they got their rank, or the higher ranks. I always enjoyed watching young people learn and grow, and most of them were just full of enthusiasm to try something different. But some were in a rut, and they weren't so eager. Some were turned inward. And even though they wanted to do something, they felt awkward. They didn't feel like they could do it. And so they just refused to try. They had their mind set on doing something, and yet they would just shut their mind down. Say, I can't do it. It's too tough. So they would go to the class, and they would sit there, and you learn things in steps. And we learn through failure. If we never fail, we don't learn much. We learn through our failures. Well, the boys would go to the class and see how something was done, and then they would get anxious, some of them. And they'd say, oh, I can't do that. Their hands just didn't feel like they were in the right place. But you got to put your hands on to learn the stuff. And it took some coaxing and some convincing to get them to understand that. They just didn't want to do those things. Oh, I can't do it. Now, we had a rule. It said, once you go to class, once you start a class for that week, you stay with it. Whether you earn that merit badge or whether you don't, you're going to stay with it. Because, once you quit, it's just easier the next time, isn't it? Yeah, it seems like we're turning into a nation of quitters. No, it's just too hard. So quit. Every once in a while, someone will say, would make a fuss. Every once in a while they did, and they talked themselves out of achieving their goal because it was just too hard. It wouldn't be long, and others then, they would get discouraged because they would see the one fussing. And then you'd have to work with them and encourage them and say, well, this fellow has a problem. We need to work through it. Have you ever noticed that whining becomes contagious, doesn't it? It doesn't make any difference how old you are. When one person starts whining, it's not long, and another one, and another one, and another one. For the one fussing, I would talk to this lad and take him down and walk him down to the class every day and encourage him to get in at least give it a try. At least give it a try. Eventually he would. And he would learn that he could do what seemed to be so overwhelming to him in the beginning. And he was overjoyed. Overjoyed. There's joy in perseverance. There's not so much joy in quitting. But it sure was trying to get him to see, listen, you can do it. You can do it. You have the skills. On the other hand, you can lead someone, though, to camp. You can lead them to water. You can lead them to wherever you want to lead them, but you can't make them participate. You can't make them to do anything. You have to convince them, encourage them to do what they want to do. Most young folks wanted to learn, how to do those things, but they had themselves convinced that they just couldn't do it before they even began the task. You know people like that? Whenever there's something new, can't do it. Can't do it. Never sang that song before, can't do it, so I'm going to stand here tight-lipped. I'm not even going to try. But these lads were afraid of failure, so they didn't even want to try. Some of them, not many of them, but some. And so they required some coaxing. Even though it becomes a little trying, in the end it's worthwhile. It's worth it all. Watching a light come on in their minds saying, hey, I can do this, I got this. What becomes really frustrating and downright irritating today is that when you talk with some people and you say, well, let's look at what this might look like if we try something different. We look at a different approach. Someone will inevitably say, well, we've never done it that way before. Or that's not the way we do it. It won't work. We tried that once 10 years ago. And they won't even discuss it. Or if you try something different, they will refuse to give it a try. And they just sit back and complain and they find fault. Those kinds of attitudes are really quite trying, aren't they? You know what I mean. You've been around and you've seen folks like that. You know what I'm saying. Have you ever been around folks like that? I know you have. That's what I just said. By their refusal to try or even seriously to discuss an issue, they are really showing their contempt for you. And believers are showing that they don't trust God. In the story, in this text for this morning, the people's attitudes are like what we've just been talking about towards God. And God became very angry at his chosen people. And he asked Moses, how long will these people despise me or show contempt for me? Because that's what you're doing when you're showing contempt for your Maker. Will they never believe me? Even after all the miracles I've done among them, will they never believe? God had just set the Israelites free from slavery in Egypt through Moses by sending 10 plagues upon the Egyptians. And he led them through the desert for a short time while providing all their needs. And now he has led them to the boundaries of the land he promised them, a land full of riches, a land full of milk and honey. As the Israelites set up camp a short distance from the land God promised them, God instructs Moses to select 12 men, one from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, to go into the promised land and reconnoiter. So Moses selected 12 men and he told them to go northward and see what the new land was like. See what the people were like who lived there. Were they weak or strong, few or many? What were the crops like? And to bring samples back if the land was fertile. What were the cities like, big or small, fortified or not? The 12 explored the promised land for 40 days and found that the land that God promised them was more, so much more than they had ever imagined or dreamed of. And our God is like that, isn't he? He gives and blesses us with so much more than we could ever hope for or imagine or envision. After 40 days of exploring, the 12 spies returned to Moses and brought back samples of the crops they found there. They brought back clusters of grapes that were so big it took 2 men to carry it on a pole. They made their report to Moses and Aaron and all the people, showing them the fruit. They said, "We have good news and bad news." Now you know what that means, don't you? Bad news. The land is indeed a magnificent country, a land flowing with milk and honey and riches. Think about that. Our God does not give his people shabby gifts or blessings. He blesses us with so much more than we give to him. They continued their report saying, "But the land is magnificent, but." There's always that but, isn't there? But says, well, it's good. It's just not good enough for me to put any effort into it. But, the spies said, the Anakim giants are there, along with the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites and the Canaanites. They are too strong for us. There are too many obstacles, and they continue to make their excuses as to why they could not go into the land God promised them. After all the miracles God had performed for them, they still didn't trust God, and God became very angry at their contempt of him. These people had left Egypt, but Egypt was still in them. The world was still in them. I've known folks who go to great lengths to make an excuse rather than to just go ahead and do something, big or small. How about you? Sometimes it's just easier to go ahead and do something, but they would rather make an excuse. They're frustrating, aren't they? If they frustrate us, how do you think God feels about such activities? After all God had brought them through and supplied what they needed to live on, the people still didn't trust God would make a way for them to be victorious in spite of what seemed like overwhelming odds. God will make a way where there seems to be no way. He asks that we trust him. Trust him. The majority report of the spies discouraged the people from taking the land, and they decided not to possess the land God promised them. Out of the 12 spies, only 2, Joshua and Caleb, gave a positive report saying, "The land God is giving us is much more than we believed. Let's go immediately and possess it, for we are able to conquer it. We can take the land. We can do it. We can do it." The people said, "You got to be kidding. We're not going to go against people as strong as they are." Then the people wanted to select another leader and to go back to Egypt. Many could not get Egypt out of themselves. They couldn't get the world out of themselves. God had a grand and glorious future plan for them, but they were content to live a life of misery. They just wanted to keep on doing what they were doing, no matter the cost. Rather than live free and trust God, they were willing to give up their freedom and return to their old miserable way of living. A life in bondage, whether it's bondage to sin or bondage to slavery or whatever it may be. In this political season, some are promising you to take you back to where you came from. You really want to go back to where you were? You know, I've always found, try as I might, you can't go back to the past because the past does not exist. You can try to go back, but things are never the same as what you think they were. I've heard it said many times, "Oh, the good old days." Well, okay, you think the good old days were so good? Try going home and going without running water for a week or electricity. And I remember my grandparents, we had to use an outhouse, and they had a well pump and an ice box. They put ice, not a refrigerator, but they put ice in it. Do you really want to go back to days like that? The good old days, we forget, weren't so good old days. The Israelites made a choice not to go into the land, and that choice affected their future. Now, there was a correlation between the choice or the decision that they made and what happened to them in their future. There is a correlation between what we are now and the decisions we have made in the past. The decisions we've made in the past have brought us to the place where we are right now in our lives, good or bad. The decisions we make today will lead us to where we're going tomorrow. In the scouting program, we try to instill in young people a can-do attitude and to enable them to innovate in various situations. In the Army, it's absolutely essential that soldiers have a can-do attitude and that they're able to innovate for the well-being of the troops and for the well-being of the mission. Can you imagine what the outcome of the mission to get our mortal enemy, bin Laden, might have been if the Navy SEALs would have said, we can't do it. It's too hard. There's no way. It's too dangerous. But they didn't. Because they didn't, the world rejoiced. For some reason, God's people always seem to say, we can't do it. That's because we want to rely on our own abilities instead of trusting God. And when they do that, they wonder why things are the way they are. Joshua and Caleb tried again and again to persuade the Israelites to possess the land that God had given them. But they refused, and they even talked of stoning them to death for even suggesting such a thing. We see some of that today, even in our own culture, don't we? Especially if you disagree with someone. Fascism even existed back in that day. I don't know that they called it that, but it was there. It existed among God's chosen people. God took offense at the chosen people's rebellion, asking Moses, how long will these people continue to reject me? Will they never believe, even after everything they've seen me do for them? Well, with a plague, God destroyed those 10 spies who gave a negative report about God's gift and promise. He said, not one of those adults who left Egypt with me will ever enter into the promised land. They will wander for 40 years in the wilderness, 1 year for each day they explored the promised land. God has promised to those who love him a beautiful land, a land that is better than anything you can envision or dream of, a land that is not of this world, a home not made with human hands, but by the hand of God Almighty himself. He asks us to take action to possess the land that he has brought us to. He has put his church here in this community, and he has led us here saying, send out your spies and learn about the land and the community and the needs of the people and help them discover the resources that are available to them, and then build my kingdom right here in Grover Hill. He has promised to be with us through any hardship we must go through and be our comfort and guide, including any hardships or illness that comes upon us. Just like God's people of old, God will give you strength and empower you to do his will and to glorify his name every day of your life. He only asks that you trust and obey him. Amen. Well, have a great and blessed week. Hope to see you Sunday.